Good morning, everybody. And this morning, I want to begin with a gospel or good news according to a famous hadith or oral tradition of Islam, which goes as follows. The last hour won't come before the Muslims will fight the Jews and the Muslims will kill them, so Jews would hide behind rocks and trees. Then the rock and the tree will cry out, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Now, that is a very popular and well-known hadith or oral tradition that is circulating among the Muslim world. Many tens of millions of Muslims know it by heart. And on October 7, the Hamas terrorists who breached Israel's border with Gaza and committed massacres and other atrocities along Israel's frontier with Gaza were quoting to one another that hadith, and all the more so as Jews literally hid behind rocks and trees at the Nova Festival or at the various kibbutzim, believing that the time that I have just spoken about had come. This hadith is an ancient or early hadith dated to early Islam concerning the end times, which is the subject of today's episode, making sense of the end times. Now, in the last episode, I spoke about the 4 reasons why the Dome of the Rock, that famous building on Jerusalem's Temple Mount, was built in the year 691 to 692 AD. To recall, those reasons were to commemorate Muhammad's night journey, to sanctify the site of Solomon's temple, to divert the Hajj from Mecca to Jerusalem, and lastly, is part of Islam's ongoing polemic or debate against Christianity regarding Jesus' divinity and the Trinity, which Islam, of course, rejects outright. That last reason that the Dome of the Rock was built that I covered in the last video will be the springboard for this episode. In this episode, we're going to talk about the final act of the Islamic age, in which Jesus returns and does something that will utterly shock most of you watching this who come from Christian backgrounds. Now, you may say to me, Steve, what about the Mahdi? I heard of a figure called the Mahdi, and he's supposed to be the central figure of Islam's eschatology concerning the end times. Well, the Mahdi is definitely a central figure in the Islamic end times, but Jesus is the central figure. The second coming is the climax of Islam's eschatology. But before I address that issue, I need to go back to the origins or the beginning of this present Islamic age, which is dated to July 16, 622 AD, according to our calendar. That's when Muhammad made what's called Hijrah, or migrated with his followers, his early nucleus of followers from Mecca, where he was resoundingly rejected by his own tribe known as the Quraysh, the dominant tribe of Mecca. And therefore Muhammad and his followers had to leave Mecca and make the Hijrah or migration from Mecca to Medina. And that is considered July 16, 622 AD, therefore as the very first day of this Islamic age. Now, 10 years later, Muhammad, the founding prophet of Islam, would die. But within just a year of his death, Islam would break forth from Arabia and conquer the 2 reigning empires of the world of that day, the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid, or otherwise known among others, the Persian Empire that day. Within 1 year of Muhammad's death, the Muslims would go on to conquer these 2 empires, each of which took centuries to be established. And within just a few more decades of that, Islam would reach the shores of Spain, conquering Spain, which would be the furthest ends of the earth in the western direction, known up until that day. In other words, nobody knew yet of the new world beyond. And it would reach as well the Indian subcontinent, where over the next couple centuries it would subdue much of what's called India today as well, thus establishing itself as the largest empire to ever have arisen on earth up until that time. Imagine that. Islam, the rise of Islam and its conquering of much of the world was the great disruptor of human history up until that point. It came out of nowhere. Bedouin tribes riding on camels, tribesmen who had come from no civilization that had reached any sort of heights in any endeavor, materially, literature, culturally, religiously, in every definition of the word savage, that as unpolitically correct as that is, would be applicable to that founding generation of Muslims. And yet those primitive savages conquered the world within just a year and beyond a couple decades following the death of its founder. And among its treasures was the holiest site in the Bible, the holiest real estate in the Bible. Jerusalem's Temple Mount would be added to Islam's real estate. And you can understand how Islam and Muslims came to believe that they are the true religion, that divine providence was the wind in the sails leading them into unprecedented conquests in the annals of human history. We're no less guilty of looking at history likewise, okay? For those of us who are believers in what we believe, we often will look at history and the way that history worked out to say, well, look, it's obvious God was behind the spread of, Christianity throughout the West. What started out as this obscure Jewish sect would go on to become the religion of the Western world. In fact, the glue that bonds the Western world, these diverse peoples of Europe, Germans, Italians, Spaniards, Slavs, there's nothing that united those people before Christianity did. And therefore, many of us watching this video are not any less guilty than the Muslims, of course, of looking at history. And there's nothing wrong with that. Looking at history as the proof behind the truth and the momentum behind what we believe in. Okay? And we, the Jews, believe the exact same thing. Jews, Christians, Muslims. And therefore, you can't fault the Muslims, and you can actually understand while within just decades of Muhammad's death, they came to believe that God was behind them and that they are the true religion. In fact, many Muslims to this day in Jerusalem, if I were to confront one of them and say, well, what makes you think, that you guys have the true religion? They'll say, well, look at the holiest site of your religion, Steve. The Temple Mount, the former site of both Solomon's and Herod's temple. What's on top of it? The Dome of the Rock, okay? The shrine that we talked about in the last episode. Is that not proof that Allah is behind all this, that Allah is driving history, that the arc of history is bending towards the grand victory of Islam at the end of the age, Steve? I mean, how can you deny that? If an Islamic shrine, if you're God, if God allowed an Islamic shrine, one of the holiest sites of Islam, to be built on the ashes of your civilization, Steve, well, how can you deny that Islam is truth? And this forward march of Islam from victory to victory, from conquering the Byzantine world, the Persian or Sassanid Empire, Sicily, Spain, and much of Europe, only would come to an end at the gates of Vienna, Austria in 1683. At a famous battle that takes place just outside of Vienna, which if the Christians would have lost, would have led to the conquering of the whole of Europe under the banner of Islam. In fact, it was this one battle in 1683 that saved the Western world from falling to Islam. So we're talking about a forward march of Islam that lasted 1,000 years before the West was able to roll back those victories. And that now leads into the subject of the end times. For since that famous defeat of the Muslims outside the gates of Vienna, Austria, Islam has suffered rollback after rollback, retreat after retreat at the hands of the infidel Christians. And since 1948, even more so and more humiliatingly at the hands of the most despised people group in the eyes of the Muslims, the wretched Jews. And these defeats compounded upon one another until the grandest defeat of all, the Six-Day War in 1967, in which Israel defeated the combined Muslim armies of Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and others, and quadrupled its size as a country within just 6 days. And this caused such a humiliation and shame to the Muslims that to this day they have not succeeded to coin a word for it. For they had coined the 1948 birth of Israel and the ensuing war that caused Israel's creation to be established, the 1948 War of Independence. The Muslims coined the word for that Nakba, or catastrophe, because they thought there would never be a worse catastrophe to follow. But when the Six-Day War happened in 1967, the Muslims, or at least the Arabic language, had exhausted its vocabulary back in 1948. It couldn't come up with a worse word for the word Nakba, for Israel's birth, to coin a worse catastrophe in the Six-Day War of 1967. And what happens is this causes many of the Muslims to take stock of the last several centuries of their history, in which the Western world, the infidel Jews and infidel Christians, have gotten the upper hand, and not just in war, but any Muslim who travels to the West, who travels to Europe, or travels to Tel Aviv, will see that the infidel peoples are way ahead of them, running circles around them in technology, in education, in every intellectual endeavor. And this caused many Muslims to have to take stock and ask themselves, what's happened to the Ummah, or Allah's faithful community of Muslims? What's behind all these reversals? And several Muslims drew the conclusion that what caused these incredible reversals to Islam were trends such as the secularization of the Muslim world leading up to that Six-Day War, the westernization of that Islamic world up until that Six-Day War, and lastly, that the Muslims were trying to defeat Israel under the false banner of secular Arab nationalism. And only if the Muslims were to fight the Jews under the only banner that has any worth in Allah's eyes, the banner of Islam, would they ever have the hope to defeat the infidel. And therefore, following the Six-Day War, we see a revival of Islam of sorts throughout the Islamic world, Muslims becoming more pious, and Islamic fundamentalism rising, believing itself to be the answer to these negative trends, the secularization of Islam, the westernization or momentum towards westernization by several of the Arab regimes up to and before the Six-Day War, and lastly again, fighting the Jews and the infidels under the banner of Arab nationalism rather than under the banner of Islam. And that's really the cause or catalyst behind the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in our day. And it gave birth to many groups, several of which you've heard of just in the last year. Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Ayatollah regime in Iran, the Houthis in Yemen, ISIS, the Islamic State, which, by the way, is becoming news again this week, and I'll readdress this hopefully before this video ends. What's happening in Syria the past week? What's that have to do with all this end time stuff? Much in every way. Stay tuned for the next few minutes. But the rise of all these groups have their catalysts in the aftermath of the 6-Day War, which was the nadir, or the lowest point probably in Islam's history since its founding. Now, all these groups, including the Islamic Republic of Iran, believe that Allah is behind them, okay? That they have arisen to redress and address the issues that I just spoke about, and they will succeed to bring about the renaissance of the Islamic mission, which is to reconquer everything that was at one time Islam, to spread the flag of Islam to the whole world, okay, to the full corners of the world, to usher in the end of the age and ultimately the day of judgment and the resurrection of the dead. And they're waiting for the rise of a guy who's called the Mahdi. Now, there are some differences between Sunnis and Shiites as it relates to this Mahdi, but they're not so major as to subtract or take away from the core of what I'm going to share with you for the remaining minutes of this episode. In other words, what I'm going to share with you in the episode here is believed by most Muslims, both Sunnis and Shiites, concerning the Mahdi. The difference being basically that the Sunnis believe that when he's born, this will be his first coming, and the Shiites believe that when he comes, it will be his second coming, that he'll be returning, that he's been here before and he's about to return, okay? And that's what the regime in Iran believes. But concerning what that Mahdi does and the chronicles of his life once he's here is basically the same. So I'm going to stick to this core here, a core that most Muslims would agree concerning the Mahdi. Now, the Mahdi hails from Medina. That's where he'll be from. And he'll be a descendant of Muhammad, the Prophet himself. In fact, he'll even share the very name Muhammad. According to the Sunnis, his name will be Muhammad ibn Abdullah from Medina, a descendant of Muhammad through one of his grandsons, through his daughter Fatima. Sunnis believe that it will be through the lineage of Fatima's son Hassan. Shiites believe it will be through the lineage of Fatima's other son Hussein, and that's one of the main differences between the two, and concerning, which son of Fatima is he a descendant of. But they agree he will be a descendant of Muhammad via his daughter Fatima, either of her two sons, Hassan or Hussein. He'll be from Medina, and he will not be anything exceptional. There'll be nothing exceptional about his piety. He'll be just an average Muslim, and maybe even a below average Muslim, okay? Nobody will look at this guy and say, oh, there's the Mahdi. But according to the body of tradition that deals with this subject, the hadith, remember I used that word at the beginning of this teaching when I shared one of the hadiths regarding the end times, about the rock and the tree crying out, about the Jew hiding behind them. Other hadiths or oral traditions, part of the body that deals with this guy, the Mahdi, say that there'll be nothing exceptional about him. He won't even be a pious Muslim. But suddenly he repents, as if in a single night he undergoes a conversion of sorts from being a not so pious Muslim or average Muslim to seeing the light, seeing the truth, and becoming a devout Muslim. And he's forced to flee from Medina to Mecca because rumor rises of his rising, and various Muslim parties reject this guy and want nothing to do with him. He flees to Mecca, and in Mecca he's popularly received and they bring pressure to bear on him to receive the leadership over them. In other words, he reluctantly, and to his credit, he's supposed to be a humble guy here, he reluctantly accepts becoming the leader in Mecca. And Muslim armies that oppose him are sent to Mecca, but before they can kill the Mahdi, the earth opens up and swallows these invading armies, which is therefore the sign that he is indeed the Mahdi. Okay, the battle to kill him, in which the ground opens and swallows up his opposition, is the sign that he is the Mahdi. And at that point, he begins to unite the whole of the Muslim world behind him. For now, all of them see that this is indeed God's chosen leader, the Mahdi. But according to Islam's traditions, and again, none of this is in the Quran, this is entirely in oral traditions, again, known the corpus of such as the Hadith. He, the Mahdi, according to these traditions, is what's going to be called the last of the minor signs of the end times. In other words, he is a central figure of the Islamic eschatology, but by the reckoning of their own sources, he's simply the last sign of the minor signs of that end of the age. Now, he unites the Muslim world behind him, and he's told that the Romans have assembled in Syria at a village that exists to this very day, a town called Dabiq. Dabiq is located about 7 or 8 miles south of the border between Syria and Turkey within Syrian territory. And according to the tradition, the Romans are considered, that expression, the Romans, is considered to be an umbrella term for basically Christendom and Europe. In other words, it's not referring to the literal Romans, but to the progeny of the Romans. In other words, Islam sees the whole of the Western world and Christendom under that term Rome. Okay, so according to these traditions, the Western world, whether it be for secular reasons or under the banner of Christendom, comes to do battle against the Muslims in Syria at a town called Dabiq, not far, as I said, from the frontier of Syria and Turkey. And the Mahdi leads the armies of these now united Muslims from the area of Arabia, from Medina, and he leads them to fight Rome, or the Romans in Syria at that area or town, Dabiq, and he defeats them. And this is an incredible war, and some people believe this to actually be the Armageddon of Islam. Now, it's interesting because the Armageddon of Islam is not necessarily the final war, but it is a major, major, major war. And some sources say that 9 out of every 10 participants in this war is killed. In fact, the war is so destructive, not only do 9 out of 10 people die, but the birds themselves fall out of the air. Now, this, of course, has led many Muslims that are familiar with this tradition and these hadiths to believe that nuclear weapons are used. For only in a scenario in which nuclear weapons were used would the birds themselves fall dead from the air or from the sky. Okay, so this is a very destructive war, but the Muslims win. Now, the tradition takes another cryptic turn, for it says that after this war in which the Mahdi defeats the Romans at Dabiq, they then go on to besiege Constantinople, today's Istanbul in Turkey. And this has caused a lot of the Muslims confusion, because Istanbul, or let's say Constantinople, the sole surviving capital city of the Byzantine Empire, when the rest of the empire had already been defeated centuries ago by the Muslims, all that was left was the city of Constantinople as a sort of this Christian enclave, this remaining Christian enclave in what had become the Muslim Middle East. Well, in 1453, the Muslims finally conquer Constantinople, make it Istanbul. And it's been Muslim ever since. So why in the world is there this tradition that in the end times the Muslims besiege Constantinople to go to war with it to conquer it when it's already been conquered by the Muslims in 1453? Well, they don't know. They struggle with this. Some of them say that perhaps in the meantime, what today is called Turkey falls and becomes Christian again, or maybe the regime in Turkey becomes secular and counter-Islam or anti-Islam, and therefore this battle is fought to return it to Islam. We don't know. Okay, this is an enigma to them. But nevertheless, the Muslims go to besiege Constantinople, and they're able to defeat it. They actually defeat it without a single arrow being shot, in a way reminiscent of the Battle of Jericho in the Bible, by their just crying out Allahu Akbar 4 times, the 4 walls of the city collapse, and they're able to take the city without a fight. Okay. Then the Muslims return again under the leadership of the Mahdi back to Syria, where they're based. Okay, they're based in Damascus. And according to the tradition, they hear that the Dajjal, which is Islam's version of the Antichrist, has arisen or has been revealed. And they go to meet him or in battle, and they don't encounter him. In fact, I know this is confusing for a minute, but it turns out to be a false rumor. So they go back to Damascus. And on another morning, when they're praying the morning prayer known as the Fajr, the Dajjal really does appear, and Jesus descends from heaven. He's being born by 2 angels, and he returns to the earth from which he left 2,000 years ago. The Muslims also believe that Jesus ascended to heaven 2,000 years ago. They just don't believe that he was crucified. And this is very important. They don't believe that Jesus was crucified. They believe that a lookalike or an imposter was crucified in his stead. And ever since, the Christians have falsely worshipped him as deity, as a god. The Muslims reject that outright, that he was crucified at all, and obviously don't believe that he's God. I covered that in the last episode. But he did ascend to heaven. And on this particular morning, after the Antichrist really has come, Jesus is born on the wings of 2 angels. He descends to this mosque in Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque, which still exists. It's one of the oldest buildings in Islam. And Jesus leads the battle against the Islamic version of the Antichrist, the Dajjal, and Jesus kills him because the Mahdi is not able to, for he was too powerful. Only Jesus, when he returns, Jesus is the one who kills the Islamic version of the Antichrist, the Dajjal. And afterwards, Jesus then rules the earth for a period of at least 40 years, during which time he is said to break the cross and do away with the pig. And maybe even kill the pig. Maybe that's the expression used. What's this mean? To break the cross, to confront the Christians with their false worship of him, and to convince them that he was never God to begin with, that he's simply a great prophet. And according to some traditions, those Christians that remain steadfast in their faith in Jesus as God, he puts them to death. Now, what does it mean when it says that he does away with the pigs or kills the pigs? Well, that's believed to be a reference to him restoring the dietary laws, many of which Jews and Muslims share, that the Christians had done away with, that the church doesn't recognize. Christianity, of course, doesn't recognize the Jewish kosher laws or dietary laws, and obviously, therefore, not the Muslim ones either. And when Jesus returns, he not only does away with Christianity and the Christians, but he also reinstitutes the dietary laws, many of which are shared by the Jews and the Muslims. And Jesus rules, like I said, for a period of at least 40 years. Jesus then marries, has children, and then he dies. He's then buried in Medina next to Muhammad's grave. Muhammad, the prophet, the founder of Islam. Now, to bring this all to an end, what's the final act of the end, preceding the resurrection of the dead and the day of redemption, according to Islam? Well, I began the episode with the hadith about the rock and the tree crying out, "O Muslim, come to me. Behind me is a Jew hiding. Come and kill him." Okay, and many people believe that to be the final act of the age. Now, lastly, before I part ways with you, I mentioned Syria. Since I made the last episode, incredible things are happening in Syria, so much so that many people are predicting the imminent collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. What's this have to do with all this end time stuff? Much in every way. For many, not all, but many of the parties fighting to bring down the Assad regime are devout, very devout, end time believing Muslims. In fact, several years ago, when ISIS arose in Syria, what was one of the very first cities that they captured and had always their goal to capture? If you remember several minutes ago, I mentioned the town of Dibik near the frontier of Syria and Turkey, where Muslims believe that an apocalyptic war between Islam and the Christians, called the Romans, according to the tradition, takes place at that town Dibik, and therefore ISIS wanted that town, believing that the day it arrived or was about to arrive, and they need to establish themselves there to be ready. Likewise, many of the groups that are fighting in Syria today share this end time eschatology and are motivated by it. The Ayatollah regime in Iran believes that its very purpose is to bring about the Mahdi. We must take this end time stuff seriously because there are major actors in the world that do. And that's how I want to close this episode. Many people will watch this episode. Some of them will say to themselves, why does any of this even matter? Nobody takes this stuff seriously to the point where they act on it. People will come up to me or to you and say, Steve, look, it's no different than those Christians who believe in the rapture. Okay, millions of American Christians believe in the rapture, Steve, but you don't see them trying to overthrow the world system to bring it about. And, that's what a lot of these people say. And therefore, why are you putting much stock into what Muslims believe? And my answer, of course, will be that maybe Christians who believe in the rapture and stuff don't feel like it's their mission to overthrow the world to make Christian eschatology come true. But there's tens of millions of Muslims who believe in their version of eschatology and are resolved to overthrow world events, to write the Hollywood script, if you will, to write the screenplay, if you will, to bring it about. And you can't understand what's happening in the Middle East, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis, the wars between them and Israel, without understanding how central Islamic end time beliefs are to those parties that are fighting Israel, who flew their planes into the towers on 9/11 and have committed thousands of other acts in between these mega attacks under the banner of Islam and the belief that they are bringing about the end times, as I've just talked about them over the last several minutes. If you want to bless Steve the tour guide with a cup of coffee, follow the link below the video. If you click on the description of the video, you can find the link Ko-fi, and there you'll find how you can support me or treat me to a cup of coffee. Whether you want to do it as a one-time gift or on a monthly basis, you can do it through that site linked below, Ko-fi. Thanks for spending your time with me, and I wish you a phenomenal day and a great weekend. This is Steve the tour guide signing off. Bye-bye.